Daniel 8, 1 through 8, the ram, the goat, and the rise of Hellenistic culture. Here we have the timeline presented in God's Word, and you've seen this often in the lessons that I've given. And the green sliver here, and I've got a handy-dandy, this right here is just the time frame we're talking about. Of course, the law has been given. We're immediately before, probably about 400 or 500 years before Christ. So our Lord God is sovereign Lord, and His providence controls the nations and the flow of time for His greater purposes. And amen to that. God's in control. Isaiah 46:9 says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do my pleasure." Now the goat, the ram, the goat, and the little horn, which is this Hellenistic culture, is in place at this time. We have been going through Daniel, of course, and we're in 8 right now. And we discussed Daniel, or we read those Bible verses earlier, Daniel 8, 1 through 2. And it's the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. And of course, he is the 3rd king in the Babylonian dynasty. And this is towards the end of the Neo-Babylonian kingdom. During this time, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel. So it's like, even little old me, Daniel. This vision appeared to me, after which appeared unto me at first. So here he was, Daniel, receiving this vision. And Daniel, of course, had been the interpreter of dreams for all these kings, and now he's getting these visions himself. It will be interpreted by an angel. This is prophetic to him, but this, as I said, is prophecy that has been fulfilled. This is concerning Israel, and it also concerns Gentile nations as they impact upon Israel's future. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw it, I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river. All right, so I'll show you where that is real quick. We'll go up a little bit here. Right here is the area that we're talking about, so we know exactly where he was in that town of Susa, one of the capital cities of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And this is the province of Elam. So that's where Daniel was at the time. This book is written in Hebrews, the Hebrew language. So it was not a court document that was done. It was not done in the courts. This is a private interpretation, so it makes sense that this was in Hebrew that was given to Daniel. Any questions? Please ask as we go along. Okay, so you've seen this slide before, and this slide shows the harmony of the different visions that we have. And of course, we're going to talk in Daniel 8, and we're going to talk about this ram and this goat, and these equate to the bear, the Medo-Persian Empire, and it equates to Greece, the Greco-Macedonian period here. And we also see those very same things in Revelation. So there's a corollary between all these visions, a harmony. And of course, it all feeds back also to the original dream of Nebuchadnezzar, interpreted by Daniel, concerning that great metallic beast. So we've covered those before, and really this is the only one we have not covered in detail. So as discussed, these are the Gentile empires that were in that dream of Daniel. Of course, the first one, the head of gold, is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And again, we have Daniel interpreting the dream. He's got a dream that he is getting for the first time in Elam over here. And he did receive that dream from the Babylonians for the most part. And that is where this empire occurred. Then we have the Medo-Persian Empire, which we're going to discuss tonight, because that is the ram, and then this is the goat down here. And this is the Alexander the Great's empire. We're going to talk a lot about those two kingdoms. Now, in Daniel 8:3 it says, "Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last." So what we're talking about here is the Medo-Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire was older. The Median Empire was also in place, but is, as you see, they're blended together, and they come together under Cyrus the Great. They give him leadership, and it really becomes the Persian Empire, even though it is these two empires joining together to defeat the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And those were the 2 horns, one Media and the other one Persia. And the one that is higher is, as we shall see, the Persian one shall grow stronger, and the one that's name is carried on into history. I saw the ram pushing westward, and notice here we have west, and this is exactly how history unfolds. First they come in and they destroy the Babylonian Empire here, and then it says it's pushing northward. And then they conquered this area here, as well as southward into this area. So that's just like the Bible says, right? Conquer to the west, conquer to the north, conquer to the south. Now this portion here was done by his son, Cyrus the Great's son, and he attacks that. So you'll see this progression in 4. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. So that's history. And you can see that history. And notice we're starting from the east, and we're moving to the west. And they conquered about everything at the time of this empire. That was all the known world really at the time. But they kept getting little chunks more. But there would be a limit to their power. And in the end, there is going to be this goat that attacks them. But right now up front, this ram is very strong, and no one can defeat them. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, continue on. Here is the earlier kings. You can call them dictators if you want. Some of these became God kings. Cyrus the Great was a pretty benevolent ruler. He did not think himself God. He was a humble individual. He was a king. He came up from shepherd stock, and his family was lowly, but God lifted him up, as we know from the scripture, and Cyrus became the king. He had one son that became king after him, Cabius, and after that the king was Darius. And we can see over here that he was a distant relative that came to power. And he was the 3rd king, and he's Darius the Great. And we're also going to speak about one more, Xerxes. So Darius the Great is the one, Night with the King. Have you seen that movie? Have you read the book of Esther? That was the king during the book of Esther's time that was in place. Yep, that was him. So he had a whole bunch of wives. And most of them were his relatives. It was very common at the time for these kings to marry their relatives, because you were godlike almost, and if you have a godlike sister, it's just like the pharaohs. The pharaohs used to marry their sisters, and eventually they became sterile, because you can only do that so long, because until genetics stopped your line. And he was making sure he had something going on here. But he did end up having Xerxes being the son that, or grandson that carried on. So anyway, direct line kings. And again, these people, I like to hear the term kings. They're always kings, but really they're hereditary dictators. That's what they are. They are in absolute power, and they are in charge. And we're going to discuss a little bit about politics tonight, because I want you to think of yourself and how you would do if you lived during this time. Now, the time of Darius the Great, this is about 500 BC, and what his realm looked like. He did wars in Thrace in about 507, 512. He took over Thrace. Took over a little bit more along the Cyrene coast here. But otherwise than that, it's about the same as what he inherited from the previous Persian kings. It's 1,000,000 square miles. It's a population of 70 million people. It is really the known educated world at this time. Yes, there were some other kingdoms out there. You had some rumblings with the Carthaginians, you had the Etruscans, but for the most part, this was civilized land that you could conquer, and they pretty much had everything. He was known as Darius Great, and of course, like I said, he is the third king of the Achaemenid Empire. So, I also want you to notice this over here. This little bitty piece of land here is Macedonia. There's a little arrow pointing here, and then there's this place called Greece. Keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to go down a big rabbit hole. I'm going to go all the way down to China here on this rabbit hole. We will discuss the improbable rise of the next beast, that goat of Daniel 8:5, who is crowned king in 1336 BC, and after subduing Greece, he goes on to destroy the Persian Empire and its last king, who is Darius III, in 330 BC. He further conquers the known world and lays the foundation for the Hellenistic thought, which is ruling over the Holy Land until Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. So we're going to look at these forces that are in play that are going to shape that whole biblical region right here in Jerusalem. Notice all this is under the control of the Persian Empire at the time. Now, here is this little country over here. How does it get to where it is going to destroy this entire empire 170 years later? And it's a fascinating thing to look at. Daniel 8:5 shows when this is going to happen. And I was thinking about this, and he's thinking about that ram and the two horns it had, and it was doing whatever it wanted to. I was thinking about this. Suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came towards the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage. That could be a canal right there, couldn't it? Interesting. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him, and the goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. So how do we get from the Medo-Persian rulers of the world, this great Persian empire that controlled millions of people, or 70 million people, and had 1 million acres? How do we get from there to this goat that is going to destroy them? I want to go back and I want to tell you a little bit about what your life would have been like. Because guess what? Most of us would not have been kings and queens and princes at the time. We would have been dirt farmers, just like we are right now, raising our herds and stuff. But I tell you this right now, knowing what control they had over the people, no Christian, American, or freedom-loving person anywhere in the world would have enjoyed life living under these absolute tyrants. Though they did have a life of laws that controlled them, and we saw those Persian kings, we saw where Darius, You know, Daniel was thrown in the lion den, and because he signed a law that couldn't be broken, he couldn't get Daniel out of there and had to wait till the morning. But could he change those laws over time? Yes, they can change and manipulate the laws. They were in charge. People lived out their lives under the dictates of the kings, these dictators, and their governors that they had in place, and their gods that they made them follow, and the priests who told you what the gods were telling you in your life what was going to happen. Power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of these kings, his family, and their trusted advisors. Your life and your family's lives were not your own. All land, property, and persons were considered the chattel, the property of the king. And it could be taken away at any time. The king could kill you at any time he wanted to, for whatever purpose he wanted to. He could take your property. He could take it away, everything that you had, because he was the king and it all belonged to him. The king could demand taxes from you at any level, and you had no say about it. No taxation, no representation at all for the taxes. Your labor, he could tell you, I want you to work on a canal. You had to do it. He could say, I would like your daughters to come work in my palace. You could say nothing about it. And they could put them in harems. And they did. And they could require military service at any time they wanted to. In fact, they did. In fact, we will see tonight, they took tens of thousands of people from these rural areas and turned them into soldiers overnight and made them come serve the king. The king, spiritually, you worship as the king allowed you to or required you to do. And we've seen those examples before. Individual liberty and freedom that we all enjoy every day when we get up and breathe the air in this country, that wasn't even a foreign concept at this time. It wasn't even thought about. They didn't even exist, those thoughts of freedom and liberty. All these people grew up their entire lives under the control of somebody. These god kings, these priests, these lords that were over them. They didn't have any concept of, I can do what I want. They do what they were told, and they lived within the parameters that they were told to live in. These thoughts of freedom didn't even exist in the collective mankind. All the world was like this. There was no freedom to speak of. It wasn't a concept yet. And I think that's fascinating for us who grew up in this nation, a nation of laws, instead of nation of God, kings, and men ruling over us. We get to do essentially what we want. And we let our neighbors do what they want. And if somebody came and told us to do exactly something and lord over us, we wouldn't take it very well. So, but these people didn't have that. It wasn't even a thought yet. Now, where did those thoughts come from? Where did they come from into mankind's mindset? Well, yeah, in part. But we're gonna get into this. This is very interesting, because all was going well in the world of Darius, and he was controlling it, and all of his subjects were doing as they said. Of course, though, we never get into the history of the slave revolts and anything like that. Rulers usually swept those under the rugs as they swept the bodies into the ditches and covered over them. So history is written by the kings, and everything was perfect in the king's realm, right? Well, it didn't go so well in 499 BC. The Ionian Greek cities, and that's over in this area here. It's called Lydia on this map. They rebelled against Persia. They were led by Miletus, which is it's right underneath here, but it's not shown on this map. That it's where that flame is. And they threw out their Persian overlords and later burned Sardis, this town right here. And there's still ancient ruins there today. There's still a town there today. They burned it to the ground. Now, you will find out that the Greek states are very independent. They're ruled on their own, and they have their own army, and they do whatever they want to, and they were very hard to coordinate with others. So on their own, they decided, well, we're going to burn it down. We're not going to overthrow them. We're going to burn the town down. Of because that was the center of power for the king, with those that lorded over them and taxed them as they chose. Now, we'll see why, but Athens, this little star right here, supported them with ships and with money as they decided to rebel. Now, I think this speaks, what we're going to show you here is the providence of God as it occurred in history. And I think we're going to look at that, and you're going to say, that was the hand of God at this time making these things happen. And I hope you can see that as we go through this. In Acts 17:26, it says, the Apostle Paul tells us, he sets the boundaries of the nation. God, that is. Acts 17:26 says, from one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that man would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him, though he may not be very far from each one of us. So, though he's not far from each of us. So this right here, what we're going to see, God allowed this to occur for his greater purposes. And we saw that in the scripture with this ram. Now we're going to see how the goat was formed and how this little piece of land that we see is going to come to power. Darius was sitting in his capitals in Susa, and he was saying, you know, I'm going to conquer this land. And he saw this occur. And in 510 BC, as he was conquering Thrace, he said, I have conquered the world. And they said, what about Greeks and the Athens? And he said, the Athenians, who are they? So these words will haunt him as we go through and look at these things. That little old Greece, what about them? Well, little old Greece was only about 50,000 square miles, a population of less than 2 million people. And they were going to be the ones that percolated all this energy that was able to feed this goat that's coming. But God created this little area of the world on purpose, for a purpose. And I think we will see real quick what that purpose is as we go through the next slide here. This is a crucible of thought where all those thoughts of freedom and a number of other things in the complete Western civilization came from. God also drew a line for the Persian kingdom not to cross, and it was right here. Their growth as an empire would stop right there on the borders of Greece. And in this small collection of islands and small collection of city-states, the Hellenistic culture that developed here would impact the land of Israel and the entire Western civilization. Every nation in Europe is part of the growth that occurred in the intellectual thoughts and pursuits of the Greeks. And I think that's just fascinating that God allowed this to occur. Now, in the shaping of the world, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And when he did so, he created this very unique location on the face of the earth. There is none like this, with these very rocky, very small islands, with a jagged, rugged coast, with mountains that almost shoot out of the waters and straight up. There's very little arable land there, and what is there is tough to grow crops on, but it's enough to sustain populations. So God created it like this for a purpose, and this is the reason, in my mind's eye, when you look at history, why that did occur. Now, in this little stretch of land, there's 1,000 Greek city-states that form. It's what they call the polis, and that just means city. We've got polises in the United States, Indianapolis, Annapolis. There's a number of them, other ones. I can't think of any more off the top of my head, but it just means town. That was their life's center. Now, they were also called Hellenes. Reason being, there was their ancestors in their mind all descended from Hellas. And it was one individual, and they called themselves not Greeks. That's a Latin term that came from the Romans, they called themselves Hellen. And you can still see the Hellenic games today, but they considered themselves not Greeks. The rest of the world called them that, but they were Hellens, and that's where you get that Hellenistic civilization. They were fiercely independent. They competed against each other, and they were self-sufficient on their own. They were rugged individualists. They were very small populations for the most part. Some of these grew later, but 10,000 people were all that were in these cities. They were protected by the mountains, the seas, the walls that they constructed, and the citizen levies. Now, what do I mean by that? Everybody could be called to join and form into an army at the moment's notice. Because when you live on the sea, someone could roll up with boats and you'd have to fight right there. And it was defensible. They had it to where they could fend it with their people. So they were historically a martial, a military society, and they were fighters, and they were prepared to fight. Because if you were not, your city would be wiped out. So cities fought cities in this region. This is, of course, where Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were, where you had Troy, which was a city-state earlier on, about 1300 BC. So this was in their blood. They considered themselves the warrior class. Every one of them read that. They put Homer's Iliad under the Bible, under their pillows, or whatever they use for pillows, fur, sheepskin, and they would read that, and that was their legacy of warrior ethos. They were sea traders. Sea trade was critical, so these people all lived within sight of the shore for the most part. There's some that lived inland, but you can see almost all of these were in very close proximity to the sea. So they were totally in this sea lifestyle, and trade was critical. The major cities established trade colonies and outposts, not only in this region, but they were over in Sicily, they were over along the coast of North Africa, along the Illyrian coast, Croatia area. They were in Sardinia. They were traders, and that was a critical part of their makeup, establishing these colonies and then stretching out from there. And because of all this, they experimented in governance. And it's amazing when you go back and read these city-states, they tried about everything. They had communism, they had kings and autocrats, they had theocracies where they were ruled by the priests. Some of them or aristocracies where they had a royal class that would be over the top of them, of the lords. And all of these things were tried in these little crucible of thought of the Greeks. And at last, what happened in this environment, these Greeks, these Hellenes, this Hellas, became the crucible of free thinking for all the sciences, the arts, the literature, the war and the philosophy, and the diverse governance. That was all being done in this area. So in this area, you had these fiercely independent, warlike people. And this was something different the world had never seen before. So that all changed for them. It changed in 547 BC as the Persians came in and they took over this Ionian coast. This portion right here is called Ionia. This is the ones that rebelled against them. They rebelled because they were used to being part of this Greek environment, and they used to trade, and they used to have a lifestyle, and that was all of a sudden they were under the thumb of these kings, or these lords, the satraps that the Persian Empire put in charge, and they had to give them money, and they had to do what they say, and they didn't like being told what to do. So then under Darius, they moved in here, and they took that area, and that's where you get the quote, Athenians. Who are they? He'll find out. Now I will read, this is a section that I took out of a book called The Life of Greece by Will Durant that talks about what these people, the democratic government that did arise. And amazing, this just arose a few years before all this occurred. The Athenians had a constitution. There were a number of those Greek city-states that had constitutions, and they brought them forth, and the people looked at them, and they changed them, and they looked at other city-states, and they developed as they went along what was acceptable laws. And again, the thought was, if we have laws, we don't have men govern us. So this was the first time those concepts came into being. Before, men fought for their king and what the king wanted. Now, these men would fight for themselves because they were a part of the franchise. They had skin in the game. Usually it was the landed citizens. They're the ones that were participating in this democratic government. So it wasn't a complete democracy. Complete democracy is where everybody has a vote and it turns into mob rule. But they had checks and balances in place to where, you know, the more land you had, the more your vote counted. And so the more skin you had in the game, the more your vote counted. And people accepted that. Some people, they still had slaves. And they still had people that were not represented because they were not landowners. So you had to have some skin in the game to be part of their governing body. Now, I'd like to read, someone could read, can you read that, or is that too hard to read? Joanna, why don't you read down to right there?
The Athenians themselves were exhilarated by this adventure into sovereignty. They realized that they had undertaken a difficult enterprise, but they advanced to it with courage and pride, and for a time with unwonted self-restraint. From that moment they knew the zest of freedom in action, speech, and thought, and from that moment they began to lead all Greece in literature and arts, even in statesmanship and more.
So here these people who had been leashed and put under the thumb, all of a sudden, they became part of deciding what their future would be. They got to have their land and their land guaranteed by them. And they're the ones that were able to say, that's my land, I vote, I'm a voter, this is part of mine. So it was, they became excited. This is the first time that they had ever been empowered. I mean, this is anywhere in the world that the grub farmer is all of a sudden allowed to take part in his government and determine what his future is going to be. Next reader, please read from they, and go ahead and read the rest of it.
Let learn to respect and view a law that was their own considered will, and to love with unprecedented passion a state that was their unity, their power, and their fulfillment. When the greatest empire of the age decided to destroy these scattered cities called Greece, or to lay them under tribute to the great king, it forgot that in Attica it would be opposed by men who owned the soil that they tilled, and who ruled the state that governed them. It was fortunate for Greece and for Europe that
go for it. Cleisthenes
completed his work in
Salon.
12 years for America.
Okay, so these are the ones that put together the Constitution, and they're the ones that had all that in place. And again, 507 BC. So you will see that they're going to be invaded 17 years later. So these people in Athens had their freedom, and they did not want to give it up to anyone. They did not want to answer to any man. Now, the one thing about this great king, Darius, if you ever went before him in a court, guess what you did? You hit the dirt. You had to bow down before the king and acknowledge he is greater than you. And the reason they get down on the ground is because you're lower than dirt to them. You do not matter. You are a subject to the king. And they could go and walk up on you and put their foot upon you. And that's, if you look in the scripture, it says, you know, make his enemies his footstool. That's exactly where you were. That was your position. You in that capacity. And these men had tasted freedom. And these people. And it's the first time in history. So anyway, what is going to happen? We're going to have a clash of these two cultures. And again, you've got 70 million people in Persia under the rule of one man. And the first thing he does is start a war. It's called the Greco-Persian War. It goes from 499 to 479 BC, a 20-year war. This is really part one. This is where Darius is in the battle. So we're going to have this Persian War. The first thing Darius does is he's going to go in here and he is going to take back this land. And it takes a few years for him to do so. He's got to move troops there. He destroys, or at least conquers, Miletus. Now the thing that he's going to find a little bit different is these people had already been defeated and subjected. As you can see, the land mass of Europe of Middle East, there was no obstacles really to cross here for an army. If you had a huge army, and Persia had a huge army, you could roll over all these people with no problem. There's nothing that could stop you if they had an army of 10,000 and you had one of 200,000. They would just overwhelm you no matter what or how good your army was. They're going to go up against something a little bit different here with the Greeks. As I said, the Greeks had honed their battle skills. The Greeks dressed themselves in battle armament for what is called clash battles. They anticipated looking at you eye to eye and killing you and getting it over with quick. They did not dally. They went right at you. So here's the Greeks, and over time what they formed is something called a phalanx. Now if you look at this, now this is the Macedonian phalanx. They modified it a little bit. But they had these 15-foot long poles with a sharp iron tip on them. And they would stand in these rows. And they would push, push, push. And anything in the way would be cut to pieces. We'll read a little bit about that later. But this is something that he had not encountered. These people were polished at war. And they would soon find that out. So here is the way the Greeks would dress. They've got this huge shield. They've got, this spear. They've also got those long phalanxes when they need it. They had a sharp chopping sword. Their faces were fully behind these masks. They had metal greaves on here to protect their legs. And they had metal cuirasses, breastplates that they wore. Now this is the Persian guy. Notice any different? He's just wearing clothes and robes. He's got a bow, he's got a spear, he's got a shield. Not metal, wood. Now, this guy is a guy that we just heard about. This guy here, this Greek, he's got skin in the game. He is fighting because you're fighting his city. This guy is fighting because he's one of these either mercenaries that are selected, or the king says, all the satraps out there, all you provinces, give me 10,000. So he'll get people from all over his country that can't even speak to the same language, get them in together, and they would rush in hordes forward and just overwhelm them with numbers. In fact, one of these troops would be whipped. The Persians would have whips and whip the troops forward into battle. So it's a completely different mindset, a completely different philosophy. So to finally get to the Greeks, after he had his, secured this again, we'll see in this green line, he is going to come over here and he is going to attack. King Darius' generals conducted, now Darius was back in his palace. He wasn't even fighting this. He sent his generals to do his work. So his generals conducted the largest amphibious assault at that time. 400 ships and 20,000 troops, 30,000 troops. It's interesting when you go back and read these. The numbers vary so greatly. So I just picked one of the numbers that was close. The Greek warships are too few and powerless to stop them. So they saw this big flotilla coming in. They were not prepared. And how could you be prepared against 400 ships? It's amazing. So they were in shock. They didn't know what to do. They called forth a call to all the Greeks to come. Now, again, all these city-states are independent groups, and it's like herding cats. You can't get them to all show up at the same time. Even if you call them, you'll get one that comes, one that doesn't, one that wants to debate it. Well, the Spartans, who are one of the fiercest people, totally militaristic, they didn't come because they were in a festival and they didn't want to go. So without the Spartans, and they would hate this later on, and they couldn't live it down. That's where they're going to show up in the next battle and be there first. But here the Spartans didn't show up, but the Athenians' general Metheltes conducted a shock attack before the Persians deployed in the battlefield and used their superior numbers against them. So what we have here is a battle called Marathon. Ever heard of the marathon? Have you ever run in a marathon? I ran in a half a marathon and about killed me. So it's 27.2 miles. So anyway, this force of ships landed on the shore here and was preparing for battle, and they were outnumbered significantly. So the general, and the thing that's interesting about Greek generals, they weren't kings. They were appointed as generals called strategos for a period of time. And after their time of service was over, they had to go back to the democracy there, and they would tell them if they did a good job or they didn't do a good job, and they could fire them and criticize them. They were accountable. They were accountable to the people, unlike the king. The king did whatever he wanted and faced no consequences. But this guy decided, I'm going to shock attack these people and see what, these Persians, and see what they're made of. So they were setting up on the beach, getting things prepared. They were at least a mile away. The Athenian general says, charge with this group right here. And they ran with all that battle gear you saw. That shows how much in shape these fellows were. And they were in shape their whole lives for this. And they trained for this. They ran forward. And they hit this line. And these guys were absolutely unprepared. They were shocked that this occurred because it was more of a dancing around. They weren't as disciplined as the Greeks. They weren't as prepared as the Greeks. The Greeks went in there and started hacking them, and then they said, fall back. Well, they fell back, and when they did fall back, there was a surge forward of the Persian line, and when they surged forward, these two wings came and struck them, and the slaughter began. Flanking maneuvers in military operations is what you want to do. You want to hit somebody from the side. You don't want to hit them from the front. They're prepared from the front. You want to hit them from the side. And if you hit them from three sides here, that is what occurred here. They were trapped in there. You can see where the cavalry came up, and they were going to get them, this cavalry, and they left themselves completely open. The Athenians wiped them out of the invasion force, and you'll hear all kinds of things. At least a third of them were killed. 6,400 Persian fighters died, and the Greeks' losses were 192. Now, I ask you, was that providence? Or was that just luck? It's amazing when you look at the battles, when it comes down to these little things that occur. This one general decided to break against tradition, not stand there. I'm going to go kill something. So he took everybody and did that. It was unprecedented that that occurred, but it occurred at that moment, and it was the right thing to do at the right time. What happened is they all got back on their boats, and they left. And they didn't see him again for 10 years. So this was a great victory for the Athenians. This little bitty state with a small population, with these highly trained citizen soldiers, were able to crush this huge armada. They left with all their ships and they went back home. So that's the Battle of Marathon. And the reason it's the marathon's 26.2 miles is because a guy ran from here, ran all the way back to Athens, and that's what that distance is here, and said, "We won, we won," and then he died. So, yeah. So anyway, fascinating, isn't it? I think that's fascinating. Just coincidence, huh? That they should win. But we're not over. You see, number one, this is the Battle of Marathon. It's 490 BC. We're going to talk about 2, 3, 4, and 5 here. And they're all just against all odds kind of things. Now, there was, like I said, there's like a 10-year distance between the first campaign that we just saw about Marathon and this second. So during this time, the Greek states, Athens specifically, says we've got to do something about this huge flotilla that came in. They could show up anywhere and wipe us out. So they used their resources to strengthen their military, and specifically by 200 triremes, which are 3-leveled ships. And I've got you one. This is kind of one here. It's not quite got the 3, but you get the idea. These are warships. And this is the front of it. It's got this big metal spike here. These guys get in here in the ship, and they row as hard as they can, and they smash that in. And you'll find out that the water line's only about that far above these rowing. So if you can get a guy to tip, it'll flood, and it will wipe these guys out. So they knew they had to have these vessels. But Xerxes, the son of Darius, because Darius died in 496 BC, is preparing too. Now look at how many folks he has. He's preparing a massive army of 180,000. Now, when you go back and read all these accounts, Herodotus said there was 1,200,000 in this force that was coming. A lot of historians go, nah, not really. That's the minimum it would be. So they would build up, and it took him this long to build this, and he had 1,000. So the total that the Greeks had were 310 of these battle vessels, and Xerxes had 1,000. Now again, the difference is in part also with the crews. When they put these crews on these ships, they might not even speak the same language. They were from all over this vast empire. So he would get levies from everywhere, stick them on these ships, and they might not even be able to talk to them. The captain of the vessel might be going row, and they're sitting there, they're doing nothing, except for they're being whipped, like in the scene from Ben-Hur. So these vessels were not manned in the same fashion by the same people. The Greeks would man all their vessels with Greeks that all spoke together. And an interesting thing also is the Greeks, notice they're all around the water, they could all swim. These Persians were from all over. Many of them, the first time they ever saw the water is when they were a rower in these vessels. So they were on these vessels. So this massive army came. And we can see the route. We know where it came from. This is Hellespont. There's really a piece of water in between here. And you might have heard Gallipoli, the Battle of Gallipoli. This is a Marmara Strait that goes between the Aegean Sea and Black Sea. And they had to get across that. Supposedly, Xerxes built all kinds of ships side by side and put ropes in them and marched his army across there in 6 days. They said his army was so huge that it would come to a river or a stream and drink it dry. They would take the whole cities and destroy them as they ate all their food. They were just eating everything as they went. It was such a huge, vast army. And they had to walk this land route the whole way. They were just too massive. And a lot of this way, the Greeks knew they were coming, and they destroyed some of this. So it was not easy going. Now, the king, Xerxes, didn't mind losing a few folks along the way. Disease got a bunch. It doesn't matter. I got 1 million of them. You know, so they kept moving. So he did not treat his people the same. In the Greek army, they were part of the government. So they treated their troops well, and they were provisioned well, and they were taken care of, and this was their homeland. So you have this massive force coming. Ignore the yellow. And it's going to come right around here. And this big fleet that he has is going to come hugging the shore the whole way. Because you just didn't get these war vessels out on the ocean, or you might have them turned over and lose the entire fleet. In fact, that's in part what happened. In 480 BC, the Persians lost 200 of their ships because they got caught in a storm over here. They turned around and went inside in the inside passage after that. So 200 ships equates to 40,000 men were lost because the ships were sunk. And you'll see this over and over and over again in history. The Spanish Armada was mostly killed by a storm. Providence, did God blow up a storm to help out the Greeks here? Okay, and that's what you got to see, these strange things occurring. Now, I said the invasion force is 180,000. It moves south down to here. A call goes out to the Persians, and they're moving. All the Hellas prepares. The Greeks are getting ready. The Spartans move quickly this time. In fact, they're the first ones to get up to this place. It's called the gates right here at Thermopylae. The hot gates, and that's what that name means. And they met there to make amends for their absence at the marathon. They had to hear about that for the last 10 years. And these were prideful warriors. When you ever heard of someone say he's a Spartan lifestyle? These people were the most hardcore military group probably ever in existence. They grew up and they were all in the military. You were either in the military or you were slaves supporting them. So they had a huge slave class, but their warriors were hard, chiseled, had to be at 60. At 60, you had to wait till then before you could be in the government because at that point you had proven yourself. They had a weight limit, or I should say a waist limit. And if you got over the waist limit, you would no longer be a citizen. They'd kick you out. So you had to be in tough military shape. You had to train. And these dedicated warriors were killers for a lifetime. And that's what they trained for. Anyway, they went up there. The remaining ships, however many there were, 800 of the 1,000, we don't really know. But it was a tremendous armada of ships came down this inside passage to take on the Greeks. All right, now the Battle of Thermopylae, that's those hot gates I was telling you about. This is the battle in which 200, this whole army came, and it was a narrow gap, and it could be easily defended along the shore. And supposedly the number is 200,000 Persians troops died just there, trying to get through that narrow gap. Now, depending upon what you read, it's between 4,000 and 300 Spartans, Thebans, and Thespians died there. Have you ever heard of the movie 300 Spartans? Now, if you read Herodotus, these 300 Spartans fought off and they killed 20,000. Well, maybe. I wasn't there. I don't know. But sometimes the winners, exaggerate a little bit. So we don't know. We do know that these men died to the last man standing. And what that gave was 7 days for the rest of Greece to prepare for the onslaught of the remaining troops that were coming, as well as this armada of ships. So what we have here is this armada of ships coming, again, a storm killed 200 ships worth, but they came through here, and the Greeks at this time had a decision to make. Were they going to fight this horde? Well, they opted to just totally leave Athens. Totally abandon it. And they decided, there's no way they're going to be able to defeat this army. It marched down, moves around here, starts destroying everything. Goes to Athens, completely burns it down. These citizens had decisions to make. They were trying to decide where to fight, how to fight. They abandoned the city, and they ended up going on these small 2 islands here and have the Navy defend them. Somebody suggested we should just surrender and kowtow, lay down to these Persians. And they were killed by the sword in the Senate building, or their version of the government building. And then the women went and stoned the family of those people that suggested it. They were serious about this. So they did a, what's that?
I said, no quitters.
Yeah. So they did a scorched earth policy, and they left. You know, they took their men. Everybody went and manned these ships. They took all the slaves and say, "You're free. You want to go fight on the ship?" Because they knew that they would be turned into slaves. The policy at this time is when you were defeated, you would either be killed. If you were a man, you'd be killed. That's it. You didn't have an option there. There were no, let's go and take them and let them repopulate. They wiped them out. The women were sold as slaves or killed. If they looked at you, didn't have any value, they'd kill you. If you're a young person, they'd keep you. Young boys, they would keep. But they knew they were going to die, and the women all knew they were going to be raped and they were going to be slaves. So they opted to go here instead and wait it out. And this is the most famous battle, naval battle in history, the largest, even up to today, of the loss of life and the number of vessels, you know, compared to this. So they were panicking, the 1,600 plus, and it could have been 500,000. We don't know. Because, again, you've got a 70 million population you could draw from. And Xerxes was really mad, so he put together as many as he could. He wasn't going to get embarrassed again. He was going to revenge his dad and go in there and wipe these, you know, these Athenians and these Greeks out. And again, this was the edge of civilization. There was really nothing over them for them to conquer. But, you know, these people were panicked. The city was sacked. They took anything of value with them that they could, and they were desperate. And it didn't look good. You had 800 vessels coming down here, or even more. We don't know for sure. So what would happen? They lost, you know, valiant effort here, but I mean, you know, they made a movie about it, so it had to be good. All right, the greatest naval battle in history. And again, ask yourself, is this providence or not? So what happened in this battle? As I told you, the Greek families went to these islands. There's 2 islands that they had. One of the Greek families was here. And they took all their vessels and they had them in this very narrow channel. And we'll go back and look here. This very narrow channel here. In the night before this attack, you know, the leader of this was the same guy that ordered these vessels, Themistocles. So Themistocles is here. And he's the commander of this fleet. And the night before, he sent a messenger to Xerxes and says, hey, you know, they're all going to try to escape tomorrow. We recommend you clog up the channel so they can't escape. So he believed him, and he sent part of his force. You know, Xerxes, naval commander, sent some of them here, sent some of them there. This is the best ones, the best fighters supposedly were the Egyptian contingent here. And they sailed back around the other side of the island to keep those Greeks bottled in because they knew that they were going to crush them. They had them outnumbered. They had them outnumbered completely. And it was just, you know, they thought it was so good about it. Xerxes, the king, sits on the side here to watch the slaughter so he can determine who he's going to award. And the king... actually, you know, you don't do well in battle, he'll cut your head off and kill you. So again, he had absolute control. So these guys were fighting to stay alive under the king. These guys were desperate. These 300 vessels here. And the ships were all by the Athenians, allies, and Spartans. What happened is this great flotilla, and their ships were probably faster, better designed, because these ships were thrown together in a hurry. Because this was not about who had the faster, cooler ships. This is about who's on that ship and how determined they were. Because what would happen in this naval exchange is they would come around here and they were bottlenecked. So they couldn't, again, it's that flanking stuff, right? They couldn't flank them over here and they couldn't get over there to flank them. So they had to go right into them. Well, all those ships got bottled in there. And these Themistocles' Greek ships, they had those prows on them. They would row in there, knock a ship out. It would sink. Go back. Do another one. Go back. Do another. For hours and hours, they would do this battle. And these people, you saw that as Persians in the robes. All those Persian fighters were on the decks in those robes. Robes and swimming don't work well together. So they were trying to, they hit the water, because once you're in the water, you could grab onto something or you could go to the shore. Well, if you go to the shore over here, you're going to be killed, because they had people waiting on the shore to kill them. If the Greeks' ships floundered, they could swim to shore. They didn't lose hardly anybody. But the Xerxes' forces lost 300 ships, another 40,000 men. And these were people from all over the Mediterranean. These were Egyptians, Phoenicians, some of the Greek Ionians from over, in this area of the map, if you move this. These rowers, these vessels were lost. And we don't know exactly how many made it out of here. But whatever made it out of here at the end of the day never came back and never threatened them again. This was at the loss of 30 ships on the part of the Greeks. Holy smokes, was this a disaster. And all these men, they didn't even get a chance to fight, because what was going to happen as far as Xerxes were concerned, this huge number of vessels would surround them, and they would board with marine-type troops, and they would board and just wipe out the ship. Never got to that point. They rammed and they rammed and they rammed until, the day was done. Xerxes set up on the hill, watched the whole thing as his mighty fleet was destroyed before his eyes. They took tail and run. The Egyptians went back. Xerxes retreats as well, and all his ships. The army does not have a navy to support them. The thought was to have these ships supporting this massive army of troops and keeping them supplied. It was gone now. So the army is supply constrained, and it withdraws. It withdraws from here back over to this area, and they were essentially abandoned by Xerxes. He went back to his palace and left his generals to fight this out. So this one engagement that occurred determined the destiny of this area. Now, they still had the army to contend with, but this right here guaranteed victory for the Athenians and the Greeks for the next 300 years they owned the sea. Pretty amazing stuff. Providence, was God involved there? Oh yeah, I think he was. I think he was, without a doubt. God shows up in some of the big, little battles, but he definitely shows up when it's tide turning, civilization turning, things like this. The mop-up action, and I say mop-up because, of course, here we have at Plata, my battery's dead here. It's in this region over here, number 5. That is where the Greeks have finally gone to war with them. Now, what they did in this situation is they got everyone from Greece to wipe them out. So they gathered 110,000 Greek troops, put them in phalanx form, and they started driving forward. At first, the horde descended on them. But when they went up against these phalanxes with these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pikes shoving them in the face, they eventually routed, ran away, and it was slaughter. 50,000 Persian troops were slaughtered before these phalanxes. And that, if you see these ancient battles, the one who runs away is the one that gets slaughtered, typically, because they will run you down with a cavalry and slaughter you. And those that weren't slaughtered there were killed and abandoned on the way back, where they were starved and harassed and had disease. They were undernourished. This entire invasion force was wiped out. At the same time, generally the same time frame, there's another great naval battle that seals the fate of the Persian fleet as the Greeks destroy them in the Battle of Makalla, which is right off this coast here. And that, again, seals the fate. So these wars that occur here are all won by the Greeks, with the exception of Thermopylae. And the Greeks turning that into a victory anyway. So the ones that mattered. And you look at this, and what's amazing, look at the Greek losses here. 500 versus 50,000. They had a technical advantage against the Persians. And they determined that right here. Because they fought completely different than anyone had ever seen with these phalanxes. So here we have this that occurred. So what was the results? The Greek Golden Age. Now the Greek Golden Age is something that occurs, that you've heard of the Renaissance before, right? This was the original Renaissance. These Greek states were able to control the trade, dominate the trade in the entire European basin. They had killed all the fighting ships from those other nations that were under the Persians. So they took control. The civilization had hordes of money coming in there from this trade. This is the time of Pericles in Athens, where they build the Parthenon, where all these great sculptures occur. The great literature, the philosophers. It's just amazing the creativity that was unleashed by these people who were no longer under the yoke of a king, and they could do what they want and think the way they wanted. They formed the Delian League after this, which is composed of people providing the money into the central fund so they can keep their navy up so they'll never be threatened again. Athens at this time rises to power because of its leadership in the war. Asia Minor cities are freed and they come back into the fold. The end result for all this is this golden age. All Western culture sprang from the Hellenistic Greek thoughts that were led by the Athens. That is a fact. All your sciences, all your philosophy, the mathematics that you've heard of Pythagoras, you've heard of Archimedes, you've heard of all these greats. These were all the ones that set in motion the Western civilization and used Greek as the means by which we categorize all the animal world, and the phyla and all that. That comes from the Greeks. So the Greeks really did found Western civilization, and this pursuit of knowledge and the arts and moderation, rather than overindulgence, and the civic responsibility that we as citizens in the polis, the city, had in order to maintain the government. And they also started taking care of their bodies more. Athletics. Who've heard of the Olympic Games. All of this was part of this Greek culture that flowered forth from this time on. But it didn't last long. The Greek disunity, because they were all separate, eventually descended into anarchy or semi-anarchy. The Greeks and Hellenes committed really political and economic suicide at this time during the Peloponnesian War, as the two sides divided between these Spartans and these Athenians. The Athenians rose to prominence and the Spartans were jealous, and eventually it came to dividing between the two. Nobody won in this. It was just an economic drain on the entire nation and made it vulnerable, and they had a downward spiral after that. After 404, even after the war was over, it was disaster for Greece. They would never rise to that height again as in the Golden Age. Plato reduced this political evolution that occurs, and this is critical for us because it's still valid today. There's a sequence of monarchy, kings ruling, aristocracy, the lords and ladies controlling over things, and controlling the government. Then we move into democracy, and then we moved into dictatorship. Now, why would we go from democracy to dictatorship? Pure dictatorship is mob rule. And mob rule does not work because it's too fluid. That's why you don't want everybody having a democratic vote and them the ones that rule. We have a representative republic because people need to think and people need to deliberate before they make decisions for all of the masses. So it just doesn't sway and move with public opinion. The government shouldn't do that. But eventually, if a democracy really comes to being, they don't last very long. And because of that, people feel insecure and feel that they cannot have a future that's predictable because of the safety factor. And they turn to somebody who is in control. This has happened over and over and over again. This happened during the rise of Hitler. This happened during the rise of the Caesars. This happened over and over and over again. If the people get too much democracy or too much freedom and everyone's a king on their own, it fails as a form of government. So the Greeks had reached this point, and what happens next is the Macedonian kings and dictators end up taking over. They call them kings. I think they're the same thing as a dictator, in my opinion. They're the ones that are in charge. It just depends on how much power you give them. But eventually, Philip II rises and he reigns from 359 to 336 BC. And he combines war and diplomacy to make Macedonia a feared and respected kingdom. He expands north to the Danube and south to all the Greek peninsulas. Many of these Greek city-states at this point were so threatened internally that all the rich people and rulers decided to give over their freedoms to this dictator because they were afraid the people would rise and kill them, which happened over and over and over again in a number of these city-states. So what they did was they traded their freedoms for security. He conquered all the city-states, or had them under his thumb, by 338 BC, with the exceptions of the Spartans. And you don't want to mess with the Spartans. Just leave them alone. So he was a military organizer. He improved the phalanx, combined cavalry and infantry tactics. He disciplined and drilled his troops. He had a professional army. He took all the lessons learned between these Greek city-states and molded him the syntagma, which is the high-tech killing machine. And it was used to wipe out armies just because of the tactics. They increased the length of the phalanx that they would carry around. By that time, it was 15 pounds. 15 pounds they carried around and thrust it as people in mass moving and wiping them out. He put heavy armored soldiers to the side and heavy armored cavalry, and he wiped everyone out. And he conquered all of Greece. And then he was assassinated. And waiting in the wings was Alexander, who would become Alexander the Great. At the age of 20, he became the king of Macedonia. So here was this man that has been brought up in this military tradition, learning how to kill effectively. And he had this tool at this time. And all of this land was conquered. So where does he go? Go east, young man. It's right over here is Persia. So here it is. Alexander the Great. Question mark? Why do I have a question mark there? After, I don't know when we're going to stop tonight, but after I get through with this, you're going to question, what does great mean? He reigns a very short period of time, 12 years or so, the reign 336 to 323 BC. He is without a doubt the most successful general in history in terms of the amount of land taken, the amount of troops he did not lose, the amount of adversaries killed. He never lost a battle. His major ones are included here as he wipes out the Persians. He was an audacious, athletic, bold, handsome, charismatic leader. That is just recorded over and over and over again. What did he really look like? Well, he has nose problems. No, that's just the whole bust, of course. But no one really knows. Now, did he have artists along with him? Perhaps, but we really don't know what his image was. But again, everyone says he was just, like a god. Isn't that interesting? In fact, he was told he was a god. There's so many tales about him. But he was a brilliant battlefield timing was one of his things. He knew exactly when to strike, with exactly the right instrument. And he led at the front. He wasn't like Xerxes sitting in the back while his generals were there. He was in the front line leading the charge at every battle he ever fought in. That's an amazing thing considering what he was doing. And, you know, it's just one sword slash and it could be it for you. In fact, in his first battle, he came real close to having his head split in half, but his friend saved him at the last moment. He received the finest military education under his father, Philip II, and his father also had him taught in the classical teachings that the Greeks had at the time. In fact, Aristotle was his teacher, the great philosopher Aristotle. He put his father's perfect killing machine that he honed over the time, the 20 years that he rose to power, he put it to immediate use. With a force of 40,000, he defeated armies 3 and 4 times larger all the time. Logistically, he maintained his forces across thousands of miles. One of the things you'll learn in military planning is it's one thing to drop troops somewhere and fight, but you got to sustain them. You got to keep them fed and supplied and clothed and keep their equipment sharp. And I say all this about who this individual was as far as outward appearance. We'll talk about more of his inward thoughts here in a minute. One of the historians I read, Abernathy, said, perhaps the most significant legacy of Alexander was the range and extent of the proliferation of Greek culture. The reign of Alexander the Great signaled the beginning of a new era in history known as the Hellenistic Age. Greek culture had a powerful influence on the areas Alexander conquered. Now, was that his intent? Was he trying to spread Greek culture? Is that really what he was up to? Well, it's already 8 o'clock, so we'll have to discuss that next week. But I think you'll find out some very amazing things, because I found out some very amazing things as I studied this. Because I've always kind of said, man, Alexander the Great was a great general. But at what cost? At what cost? And we'll see that cost next time.